Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today. It's great to be here again. So about a year ago, I gave a talk here in Lubbock, Texas, of all places, where I discussed the phenomena of temple denial and presented historical and archaeological evidence for the existence of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. After my talk, I was approached by a member of the audience who asked me, but what about the whole theory that the temple was in the seat of David? I responded that the theory contradicts the biblical, rabbinical, historical, and archaeological data accumulated in the past 160 years. But more than anything, it goes against common sense. But then again, common sense ain't so common these days. When I asked my colleagues, some of Israel's most accomplished archaeologists, they were astonished to hear of such a ridiculous idea, and most had never even have heard of it. The very fact that they have never heard of this theory demonstrates how outlandish and ridiculous it is actually so wrong that it doesn't even pass academic scrutiny. When I asked my boss, who was probably the world's leading biblical archaeologist, a man so knowledgeable on the subject of ancient Jerusalem about this theory, he replied, yes, it's a bunch of rubbish that doesn't even deserve a reply. The reason that we've decided to respond to such theories is because they are becoming so pervasive among the uneducated. If one were to type the true location of the temple in a YouTube search, a dozen videos proposing various theories would appear. The propagation of this lie is becoming a dismissal of Jewish history and a disempowerment of Jewish identity and heritage regarding the Jews' most important site. Moreover, it is becoming a desecration of the name of the God of Israel. Now I will show you just how wrong these theories are. So in this day and age, with YouTube and the internet and the free flow of information, it's very, very easy to get carried away sometimes, especially on a Sunday afternoon, when you have time. And some believe that the world is flat. People who like this theory actually are very proud to have believers all around the globe. Some believe this. There were dinosaurs at the Civil War. Y'all never heard of this theory? I mean, wouldn't that have been great? And some believe this. Y'all understand what you're seeing here? Okay, so we see the temple located in the city of David and not on the Temple Mount. Actually, this depiction is wrong for so many reasons. I don't remember the last time there was a hump in the Ophel, but whatever. Now, we're not going to be naming any names today. It's just unprofessional, but several books have been written in the past 20 years or so on this topic, and various locations have been offered as long as it's not on the Temple Mount. Now, these theories are based on several assumptions. We're going to be dealing mostly with the City of David theory, since that's the one that has gained the most attention. So, the first premise is based on the fact that the term Zion, or Zion, refers to the temple. But it refers to the temple and refers to the city of David. It refers to both. So every time that the Bible says Zion, it's referring to the city of David, since Zion is the city of David and nothing else. That's all it is. The second premise is that the temple required a live water source. Now, the only real live water source, the only substantial water source in Jerusalem is the Gihon spring, right underneath the city of David, and therefore the temple had to be located somewhere just above that area. And the last one we're going to discuss today is the fact that there was a Roman fortress called Antonia, and this fortress housed many soldiers, about 10,000 Roman legionnaires, and therefore the only area large enough to hold such a large military force is the Temple Mount, and therefore it had to be this Roman fortress called Antonia. So first of all, Zion. Is Zion only the city of David? Well, it's mentioned 154 times in the Tanakh, and it has more than one meaning. So originally, yes, it's true, Zion referred to the fortress of Zion, which is also called the city of David. David captured the stronghold of Zion. That is the city of David. By the way, the stronghold of Zion is not the whole ancient city of Jerusalem. What we refer to today as the city of David, we are talking about the entire southeastern ridge, which is the whole ancient original city of Jerusalem, the real old city, which is actually outside the walls. But today the name stuck to the entire area of the city of David. But again, originally the city of David is referring to a location within ancient Jerusalem called Zion. So in the time of King David, Jerusalem spreads from the southeastern ridge north towards the direction of the Temple Mount. And King Solomon, of course, builds that temple. And a great verse that portrays this historical fact is from Psalms. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, his holy mountain. Beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion in the far north. So from this verse we can understand two very important geographical facts. First of all, we're talking about a mountain. Geographically, we're talking about a mountain. Second of all, we're talking about a mountain that is in the far north. In the far north of what? In the far north of the original city of Jerusalem, which is again the southeastern ridge of Jerusalem. So the far north would be, give or take, the area of the Temple Mount today. So again, Jerusalem the Temple Mount is referred to Mount Zion, and not Zion. It's referred to Mount Zion. It sometimes is referred to Zion, but usually we're talking about Mount Zion, and I'll read you a verse. Then the Lord will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, even smoke, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory will be a canopy. And we have other verses. So who dwells on Mount Zion, Isaiah, and so on and so forth. During the 8th century BCE, give or take in the time of King Hezekiah, Jerusalem spreads even larger and encompasses what we know as today as the Jewish quarter, the Armenian quarter, or the northwestern ridge. In the photo, you can see the famous broad wall, which you can see today in the old city of Jerusalem, in the Jewish quarter. And this wall reflects the expansion of Jerusalem during the period. Archaeologists don't exactly agree as to why Jerusalem expanded, but that's not what we're talking about today. And here's a verse that beautifully portrays this expansion. Our feet shall stand within thy gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built as a city that is united together. So we see this expansion during the 8th century, and we can identify it archaeologically. So again, during the 8th century and after, Jerusalem and Zion become synonymous. It is basically one and the same. And here's a verse. This is the word that the Lord hath spoken concerning him. The virgin, the daughter of Zion, hath despised thee, and laughed thee to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem hath shaken her head at thee. Again, this is talking about the Assyrians, but you can see a clear parallel or a synonym, if that's the correct word, between Zion and Jerusalem. And we have another verse just below it. Awake, awake, clothe yourself in your strength, O Zion. Clothe yourself in your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. Jerusalem, Zion, synonymous. Zion is also synonymous with the people of Israel and the entire land of Israel. For I will bend Judah as my bow, I will fill the bow with Ephraim, and I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and I will make you like a warrior's sword. The punishment of your iniquity has been completed, O daughter of Zion. He will exile you no longer. So we see here that Zion has more than one meaning, and it doesn't only mean the city of David. So that's the first thing that we knock down. So what does the Bible say? The Bible is very clear about where the temple was built. It's clear about the location, the geographical location of the temple. And here's the verse from Chronicles. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So we're talking about Mount Moriah, and we're talking about a location that was outside the city, okay? And this was an area of agriculture. This was an area that was outside the city. Again, only towards the end of David's reign and during his son Solomon did Jerusalem expand to this area. Now, threshing floors were outside the city. This is very important. Again, the Temple Mount was outside the city. In biblical times, we know this from verses in the Bible, and we know this archaeologically. There were PhDs written on the topic of agriculture during biblical times, and we know this for a fact. Here we have some verses. And there came an angel of the Lord and sat under an oak which was in Ophrah that pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite. And his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide from the Midianites. He was threshing wheat in the winepress because the winepress is situated within the city limits, closer to the city. It's also easier to hide in the winepress because it's deep down under. And this is a very nice biblical portrayal of this fact that the threshing floors were outside the city. And here's another one. Then they told David, saying, "Behold, the Philistines fight against Keilah, and they rob the threshing floors." The threshing floors are the first things that they can rob because they're outside the outskirts of the city. And here's from Ruth. "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor," and then we see, "Then she went into the city." So threshing floors were outside the city, therefore it couldn't be the original threshing floor of Ornan couldn't be in what we call today the city of David. Now, again, we're talking about geography here. This is very important because these are facts that are just not looked upon or just, what's the word I'm looking for? Ignored. That's a good word. All the biblical sources refer to the place of the temple as being on top of a hill. Read my lips. On top of a hill. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the father's household of the sons of Israel, to King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord from the city of David, which is Zion. Now, how do they ignore this verse? I have no idea. Can I hear up? So God came to David that day and said to him, "Go up, erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite." And David went up, according to the word of God, just as the Lord had commanded. Then Hezekiah took the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it, and he went up to the house of the Lord, stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord. Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord? Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will tell you. Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "The mount of the Lord, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided, in the mountain of your inheritance, the mountain of the house of the Lord, the mountain of the house of the Lord, the mountain of the house of the Lord." Mountain of the Lord, on this mountain, in the holy mountain, on the high mountain of Israel, on my holy mountain, on the high mountain of Israel, on my holy mountain, on my holy mountain, on this mountain. Are we getting this? Just bear with me. My holy mountain, who may dwell on your holy hill, on this mountain, on my holy mountain, on the high mountain of Israel. Now, let's go to Josephus. Josephus was the most important historian of the Jewish people who lived in the first century, and he witnessed the temple and its destruction with his own eyes, and he also wrote about the general history of the Jewish people, and of course the temple is the most important building of the Jewish people. So he says, "This hill it was, which Solomon encompassed with a wall, it was of excellent workmanship upwards and round the top of it. This temple, as I've already said, was built upon a strong hill." Now it's time to look at Jerusalem. So we see the white dotted line. That's what's called today the city of David, or the southeastern ridge, the original city of Jerusalem. And it's actually not a mountain. It is a spur. It is a ridge that comes down from the summit, which is Mount Moriah, And the only mountain in the area is, again, right above it, Mount Moriah, with a 740-meter elevation, as opposed to 620 meters at the bottom of the city of David. So it's not exactly a mountain, and it can't be called a mountain. Here we see a good picture from the 1930s, if I'm not mistaken, and you can see how the area of the city of David declines rather sharply right after the Ophel, which is south of the Temple Mount. And again, we're not talking about a mountain. And here's a verse and a topographic map. You can see the city of David. For those who can't read Hebrew, that's the city of David. That's Mount Moriah. And the verse reads, "As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people." Okay, so Jerusalem is actually low-laying compared to the rest of the area, to the rest of the mountains that surround it. So how can you call it a mountain when the verse says clearly that mountains surround Jerusalem because it is lower? And if whoever has been to the city of David can see this for himself. Josephus says the hill of the temple was a rocky ascent that declined by degrees towards the east part of the city, which is exactly what we can see here on this map. Another topic, and we're still in a geography lesson here. Nothing better to do on Sunday. So Mount Scopus. Now, why am I bringing Mount Scopus? Because Mount Scopus is an area that is well known today. You might know it as the place where we have one of the Hebrew University campuses, and we have the Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus. But it is also mentioned in historical and rabbinical sources as a place called Sopus in Greek, and from there, this is Josephus, a plain view might be taken of the great temple. This place, and he tells us exactly where it is, on the north quarter of the city, was about 7 furlongs from the city, distant from it, which means that it's pretty close. We're talking about a few hundred meters. So we know that it's north of the city, we know that it's pretty close, and we know that we can see the temple. Again, we have several quotes here from Josephus, again, from various historical accounts mentioning this location and the fact that we can clearly see the temple from this location. And here we have a rabbinical source talking about the Pesach offering, which had to be consumed in the vicinity of the temple in Jerusalem. And we have a Mishnah here from Pesachim, which states that if one suddenly notices that he has some flesh which was not burnt and has to be burned in the vicinity of Jerusalem and the temple, the last place that he can still burn it is if he's on Tzofim. Why? Because from there he can see the temple. If he passed Tzofim, they don't bother him to go back, and he burns it wherever he is. But Tzofim is the last place from which you can see the temple north of the city. And here's Tzofim right above. You can see the ridge with the antenna right above the Temple Mount. That whole ridge is Tzofim. So what's the problem? Can anybody guess? I'm sure you all can. You just can't see it. You just can't see the city of David from Mount Tzofim. I know this because I walked to work for 12 years, taking the bus, and I walked on Mount Tzofim and looked towards the direction, and you just don't see it from Mount Tzofim, and that's the view from Mount Tzofim, so it can't be anywhere else. Definitely not in the city of David. And here's a famous teaching from Makot, from Talmud Bavli, which talks about the story of Rabbi Akiva and other sages which were approaching Jerusalem. And when they arrived at Mount Scopus, they rent their garments, they tore their garments. Again, why did they tear their garments? Because you can clearly see the site of the temple from Mount Scopus. Now this story is also a segue to another issue which is raised by these theories, and that is that the Jews simply forgot the location of the temple. It's true there were various times in history after the destruction when Jews were not allowed in Jerusalem. But to say that Jews actually forgot the temple is a little bit too much. If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill, may my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. So the story that we learn from the Gemara, this is again, from the Talmud, this is again after the destruction. We have sages in the 2nd century CE that know where the temple was, and this continues on through the generations. And a very clear indication of this is in the Byzantine period, which follows the late Roman period. We have various etchings, various inscriptions etched on the stones of the Temple Mount in several locations, and they are dated to the Byzantine period. A very famous one is located right underneath the famous Robinson's Arch, and it's pretty high up. And it reads, "Ureitem v'sas levavchem v'atzmotechem kadeshet tifrachna," which is, when you see this, your heart will rejoice and you will flourish like grass. And this is from Isaiah, again etched on the temple, on the western wall, just south of where the women pray. So the truth is that Jews never forgot the temple, and that whenever they were allowed access, they came as close as they can to the temple. Sometimes they prayed on the Mount of Olives. Another very important historical document comes from the Cairo Genizah, and it is dated to about the 9th to 10th centuries of the Common Era. And what it is a prayer which is said upon approaching the walls of the Temple Mount, and there were prayers said at every different gate. This is actually a tradition that has been resumed in the past 20 or 30 years or so. And here's a nice depiction from the Ottoman period of Jews coming as close as they can to the location of the temple, as close as they were allowed. So the claim that I have heard by these people is that when did the mistake happen? When did the false identification of the Temple Mount as such happen? It happened during the Crusader period. So the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099, and the Islamic shrines were already existing on the Temple Mount. We have the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, and they renamed them and used them for their own use. So the claim is that the Dome of the Rock, and this is true, was turned into a church called Templum Domini. And because they called it Templum Domini, ever since then, so people made an error and thought that that was the location of the temple. Now, is this true? No. During the early Islamic period, Jerusalem in general, and the Temple Mount in particular, were linked to the Jewish temple. Okay, this is very important, and this is well known. One of the names of Jerusalem was Beit el-Maqdis, which is Beit HaMikdash. There is no such word in Arabic. This is a term borrowed from Hebrew. And numerous Islamic traditions actually associate the Dome of the Rock with Solomon's temple. I'm only going to show you one such artifact, and that comes from, by the way, some of this I might have covered in my previous talk, but it is very important for this topic as well. And this comes from the village just north of Hebron, a village called Nuba. And in this village, in the mosque of the village, right over the Mihrab, which is the direction of prayer, there is a stone, an inscription in stone, which is in secondary deposition, which is probably dates to the 9th century, even though the inscription itself tries to lean on Omar, the Caliph Omar, who was the caliph who conquered Jerusalem. He came after Muhammad, and he's the one who conquered Jerusalem. And the inscription reads that Omar the Great, or whatever, I don't remember the exact wordings, dedicates all the lands of Nuba, this Arab village, as a waqf, as an endowment to Sakhrat Beit el-Maqdis and Al-Aqsa Mosque. In other words, we have a reference here to two separate structures on the Temple Mount, one of them called Sakhrat Beit el-Maqdis, and one of them called Al-Aqsa Mosque. You know, Al-Aqsa Mosque we all know. It's the structure on the southern part of the Temple Mount. And what's Sakhrat Beit el-Maqdis? First of all, let's translate that to English. The stone of the temple. Okay? This is a clear indication of the unbroken tradition that the Muslims actually got from the Jews. And we have many other stories, but we just don't have time to tell them, to the fact that the Muslims actually preserved the location of the temple. And it didn't come from the Crusaders. Now, we're going to ask a question about archaeology. Archaeologically, could the temple have been in the city of David? Well, let's go ahead and see. So the city of David is the most excavated location in the land of Israel. We have 160 years of research in this small plot of land. And among the researchers, we have the very pioneers in the field of archaeology. And the map that you see on the right is excavated areas in Jerusalem. Of course, the Temple Mount, you can clearly see that it hasn't been excavated at all. But just below it, the city of David, we see all the red areas are heavily excavated areas. And here's a quote from Roni Reich and Eli Shukrun. And they're not this quote comes from just the old article, and they're just talking about the archaeology of the city of David, and they're not talking about these theories. It has nothing to do with these theories. And what they say is the area we are talking about, the eastern slope of the city of David, and particularly the strip above the Gihon Spring, has been subject to more archaeological excavations and research than any site in Jerusalem and even in Israel. So if there were a temple there, we would expect to find some remains of it. So the Ophel was dug up, excavated by Eilat Mazar. Many important artifacts were found here, such as a Solomonic wall dating to the 10th century BCE, the seal of King Hezekiah himself, possibly Prophet Isaiah, but the temple wasn't found. Givati parking lot is a very large excavation. Many important artifacts were found. The whole area was gutted, as you can see, but no remains of the temple. And this is a picture of the large stone structure which Eilat Mazar, who excavated there, this is right underneath the visitor center of the city of David, associates actually with King David's palace, but not with the temple. The entire ridge of the city of David was excavated, and again, no temple. The area right by the Gihon Spring was excavated, and all kinds of weird etchings were found, and some tried to say that maybe aliens are behind it, but no temple. Just no temple. Now, but let's say that all the stones were taken and all the artifacts were taken and there's nothing left. Could we have put the temple in the city of David? So let's go ahead and see that. So the Jewish tradition teaches that the Temple Mount itself, meaning the sanctified area, was 500 cubits square, or about 861 feet square. This cubit is the royal Egyptian cubit, which is what was mostly used during the first temple period, which is when the first temple of Solomon was built. So if you were to take a 500 square cube and try to stick it over the city of David, you're going to be faced with a little bit of a problem, and that is that there's just no room. The square will go over into the valley and onto the Mount of Olives, and it's a big mess. Now, during the Second Temple period, we run into even worse problem, and that's that the fortification line in the city of David during this period is even narrower than during the First Temple period. So during the First Temple period, the fortification line goes down on the middle of the ridge, and there were actually houses built with terraces in a very complicated way, but there were houses built on the ridge itself. But during the Second Temple, Jerusalem, the other locations were more heavily housed, and therefore it's very hard to think about King Herod's temple, which the sages of Israel say was the greatest building ever and the most beautiful building ever, and we also know to what extent King Herod enlarged this temple. It's absolutely impossible that it was on that ridge. There's just no room whatsoever. And just imagine, you can see the ridge clearly, imagine a temple going up into the air, the platform into the air and onto the Mount of Olives, and there's just no room. Like I said, another indication, again, we're talking archaeology here, is that the entire ridge, like we said, the entire ridge of the city of David was excavated, heavily excavated, and what we're seeing here are dwellings. These are houses built during the First Temple period, 8th, 7th centuries BCE, and this would have been during the time when the temple was standing. So it's a little bit hard to understand how these theorists would explain houses underneath the temple. I mean, you would have to dig underneath the foundations of the temple and put those houses there. It just doesn't seem plausible. Now, during the Second Temple period, we have very large earthen fills which stretch from the bottom of the valley below the city of David and right up to the ridge of the city of David, about 70 meters, 230 feet of earthen fills. Not just any earthen fills, garbage. This is a very sophisticated method of disposing of garbage where you would bury it in layers. And I don't think they had any garbage underneath the temple. And another problem is a simple problem that these fills are unstable. So if you were to put a temple on those fills, they would collapse. So archaeologically, just doesn't make sense. Now, what about the whole water issue? Yes, water is a problem in the Middle East. And they got everything covered. They got everything nailed down, and they took care of it. And we have verses discussing the water and various vessels that were used. And we have teachings from the Mishnah, which talk about in the chamber of the exiles, there was a fixed cistern from where water was provided to the whole Azara. Okay, so there's much discussion about cisterns which provided the water needed for the temple. These were the officers that were in the temple, and there's a whole list of various positions that were occupied in the temple. And one of them is Nechunya, who was the digger of pits or cisterns, and he was responsible for excavating these cisterns, which would collect the rainwater and be used in the temple. And this is a map by Charles Warren. We know about at least 49 cisterns on the Temple Mount. So water wasn't that much of a problem. And one very large one, cistern number 8, actually resembles First Temple period cisterns, which we know from First Temple period excavated towns such as Bet Shemesh and Beersheba. So this is even larger and may very well date to the First Temple period, and therefore may have provided water to Solomon's temple. This is a cistern excavated below the Temple Mount, right underneath the area of Robinson's Arch, so the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount. This is a large First Temple period cistern. It is dated by its style and by its plaster to the First Temple period. And as archaeologist Eli Shukun, who excavated, says, it probably provided water for the temple itself. Another Mishnah tells us water may be drawn on Shabbat by means of a pulley from the cistern of the exiles and from the great cistern. So we're not sure exactly what the great cistern is referring to, but there is a very large cistern. The largest cistern on the Temple Mount is depicted from a painting done in 1870, and this Mishnah might be referring to this cistern. Another water source talked about by the sages is the aqueduct, which flew there from the spring of Etam. Abaya said, we infer therefrom that the Etam spring was at least 23 cubits above the ground of the temple court, meaning that this aqueduct utilized the force of gravity to bring water from a very distant location all the way to the Temple Mount. And we are familiar with this archaeologically, historically, and these are the famous Solomon's pools south of Jerusalem, which were filled by springs, by various springs, and then aqueduct, which came out of these pools. So the one on the right, how do you say, wiggly? So the wiggly one on the right dates as early as the 2nd century BCE, and actually we can follow its course all the way to right above the Temple Plaza, the Temple Mount Plaza, which you can see above, and we know historically that it led straight into the Temple Mount and supplied the needed water to the Temple Mount. Could the Temple Mount be Fort Antonia? So we're familiar historically with this fort. Josephus talks about it, and he says that it was situated on a higher elevation than the Temple Mount. And this makes sense archaeologically. There is no issue with this, there is no problem with this, and all the claims are false. So Josephus writes, for the temple was a fortress that guarded the city, as was the tower of Antonia, a guard to the temple, and it was that tower were the guards of those three. Okay, so here we have an old aerial view looking north, and you can see the El Moriah school over here is situated above the Temple Mount, and there is a rock scrap there, a rock face, which is higher than the Temple Mount. And you can see here in a geographic map, this is called the Antonia Hill, which is exactly where we expect to find it according to the historical sources, and we can see that it is above the Temple Mount. And if you look today in the northern corner of the Temple Mount, you can see part of this rock face which is exposed where the Antonia stood. And several archaeologists have identified Herodian masonry just above this rock face, and those niches which were used for placing the beams that were part of the royal not the royal, but the porticos that surrounded the Temple Mount. And here is how it would have looked in the first century. Now, why is the Temple Mount not Antonia? So, from what I've gathered from these theories, there's a very elementary and a little bit of an embarrassing mistake here of just noticing coincidences and paying too much attention to coincidences. So the claim is that the Antonia fortress has to be the Temple Mount, so the Temple Mount is sort of rectangular, and Roman castra or castrum were rectangular or square or whatnot, and it looks exactly the same. It doesn't look exactly the same. These are about 35 acres, that's about 35 acres, bingo. It's just a coincidence. By the way, did you ever notice that your finger fits exactly into your nostril? So the Temple Mount is a very complex archaeological structure. It is not a single structure. It wasn't built in a rectangular way from scratch, and it's just a very, very naive thing for someone who came for 2 days as a visit to Israel, and came up with all kinds of theories. But we see here various differences, which we're not going to go into. But just one very important quote from Josephus is that it looks like a tower, and the temple, and that's how Antonia was reconstructed by historians, and that is, we're not going to get into, did Antonia protrude into the Temple Mount or not? That doesn't really matter. The bottom line is that it looked like a tower, and nothing like the open court that is the Temple Mount today. Now, so we mentioned earlier that there's a claim that where are you going to house 10,000 legionnaires? Where are you going to house them? And yes, there was a very large military force in Jerusalem called the 10th Roman Legion, Fretensis. This was a very powerful military force in those days that was in Jerusalem. But there's only one little problem. They weren't there before the destruction. If they were there before the destruction, the rebellion would have been quelled in 66. There would have been no rebellion. The Jews of Jerusalem had no chance against a 10,000 Roman soldiers inside the so-called Antonia fortress. Another very important thing to say is that the Antonia fortress wasn't built as a Roman fort. That weren't the specs. It was built as a fortress originally by the Hashmoneans in the 2nd century BCE, and then Herod expanded it or refurbished it. It was built specifically as a tower to guard the temple. It wasn't built as a Roman fort. Yes, there were Roman forces inside that structure, but it wasn't built as a Roman fortress. And by the way, historically, archaeologically, the number of Roman soldiers who, by the way, weren't let's call them full-blown legionnaires. They were more like auxiliary forces. There were between 400 and 1,000 soldiers in Jerusalem. That was the number that the archaeologists know of today, and there was no legion. Therefore, we don't need to worry about housing for 10,000 soldiers. And here's an indication from Josephus. This is from the rebellion, when the Jews rebelled against the Romans, and he talks about the fact that the rebels, the zealots, made an assault against Antonia and captured it in 2 days. So it's a little bit hard. It's a little bit of a hard thought to imagine 10,000 soldiers being conquered by a few crazy Jews in 2 days. Again, we're talking about the most heavily armed, well-trained force in the ancient world. Another issue is the fact that the Antonia fortress was destroyed. The foundations were dug up, and we have here the quotes from Josephus. And Titus gave orders to the soldiers to dig up the foundations of the Antonia, and in 7 days' time they overthrown the foundations of Antonia, and they used it as a location from which they breached into the Temple Mount. Another important historical fact, archaeological fact, there's a quote from Josephus which indicates that, and also you can see in the picture, that the Temple Mount wasn't built in a single day. This was a project which took years, and again, we're talking about the expansion which was planned by King Herod the Great, but we have historical indications and archaeological indications that it was not completed in Herod's day. And what I want to show you now is another indication that the Antonia cannot be the Temple Mount. So right underneath Robinson's Arch, we're doing a lot of Robinson's Arch today, they dug straight to the foundations of the Temple Mount. Okay, so what you see here is the very lowest course of the Temple Mount resting upon bedrock in the southwestern corner. And what you see there are very large pavers which are sealed below the foundation of the Temple Mount. And one thing that we have to talk about historically is the project of expanding the Temple Mount was a very, very large project, and part of this project required, how do you say lafkia? Lafkia. No, basically to confiscate structures that were in the area. Okay, so the government had to do some land grabbing, and what we see here is what was underneath the foundation of the Temple Mount in this location, and we have steps leading down, and this is a mikvah. This is a ritual bath. This is a ritual bath which was, again, underneath the foundations of the Temple Mount, and the pottery is 1st century pottery, and the latest coin dates to 17 to 18, and it can't be any earlier than this latest coin, which is way after King Herod's reign. We're talking about the 1st century. King Herod died in 4 BCE, so this can't be the Antonia. Why can't this be the Antonia? Because why is the Antonia named the Antonia? It was named after Herod's boss, basically, who was Mark Antony. Mark Antony was out of the picture in the year 31 BCE. He was defeated by Augustus in the Actium battle, and therefore it could not have been named after Antonia, because Herod would have found himself with one less head. So the Temple Mount is the Temple Mount after all. We're going to look at some very basic archaeological evidence. And the first thing to keep in mind, these are from Josephus, is we have historical sources which tell a lot about the Temple Mount, and the only structure in Jerusalem that matches these historical sources is the structure known as the Temple Mount. So these sources talk about King Herod's expansion of the Temple Mount. So what we see today is twice the size of the original Temple Mount, and this is part of Herod's expansion, which again we just saw was finished long after he died. But we can identify this expansion according to the historical sources. Here you see the various phases. So the yellow is the original 500 square. The orange is an expansion to the south, probably during the days of the Hashmoneans, and the gray is all of Herod's expansion and planning, and here we see it. So this is a very complicated structure, and no other structure in Jerusalem matches the historical sources. And here we have some really ancient stones on the eastern side of the Temple Mount. The reason being that the eastern side of the Temple Mount was the only side not expanded by King Herod's plan. This is probably just due to the sheer drop, the cliff, which was just too complicated for them to expand towards the east. Here we see the famous seam in the southern and the southeastern corner of the Temple Mount, the clear break in the building, and the right, the masonry on the right is from the Hashmonean period, and to the left is Herodian masonry. Okay, so again, the archaeology fits the historical sources, and again, there is no other building or structure which matches these historical sources. And here's just some very basic things that I might have covered in my other talk, but we have a quote talking about the western side of Herod's expansion, and he talks about four gates, and the first led to the palace by a passage over the intervening ravine, and this is the famous bridge from Wilson's Arch, which led up to the area of the palace, which is where you have those red rectangular-looking roofs. Here we have Wilson's Arch today. The two other led to the suburbs, so we can identify these gates that Josephus talks about. They're exactly the right number, and note that there are also monumental gates, very, very large, very, very overwhelming gates, and not gates that you would expect to find in a Roman fortress, since it can be easily accessed by anybody. Barclays Gate, this is in the women's section, in the plaza of the Temple Mount. You can see it from inside the Temple Mount as well. And the last led to the other part of the city, from which it was separated by many steps going down to the ravine, and from here up again to the hill. And of course, this is Robinson's Arch, which supported a massive monumental staircase which led down to the street. This was the first ever overpass in the ancient world. Actually, archaeologists think that it might have taken them 2 tries to build it. They think that it collapsed the first time, and then they fixed it up and found what their errors were and built it up again. But I don't think you have monumental staircases going into fortresses. The fourth front of the temple, which was southward, we're talking about the southern part of the Temple Mount, had indeed gates in its middle. And we find gates in the southern part of the Temple Mount. We can see the lintel of the gate, and we can't, but we know what's inside, and these are tunnels leading underneath the southern part of the Temple Mount, and with staircases up to the plaza of the Temple Mount. And the reason this is very important, this area, which by the way the Muslims declared a mosque in the late 90s, is we have the most elaborate, well-preserved Herodian Second Temple masonry in the land of Israel. We have these domes which can be seen today, and these columns. This is the most well-preserved Herodian masonry in the land of Israel, dating by the top experts in the field of Roman archaeology to the 1st century, exactly to the time of Herod's temple. And here we have, this is the design on one of those domes. Also, it had the royal cloisters, or stoa, or portico, or basilica, wherever you want to call it. And this was a very, very impressive structure, according to Josephus, on the southern part of the Temple Mount. The longest building in the ancient world, the building with the most columns in the ancient world. And as Josephus said, it was a structure more noteworthy than any under the sun. And here we have an archaeological reconstruction of it. And this is Professor Benjamin Mazal, who excavated right after the 6th War, right in the southern part of the Temple Mount. Found all the rubble that was knocked down by the Roman soldiers. You can see all the rubble and all the stones that were toppled on purpose by the Roman soldiers. And we find exactly what we expect to find according to the historical sources, which is the most elaborate and largest selection of Herodian architectural members right underneath where the stoa stood. We have column drums and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds upon hundreds of carved stones, and with the most beautiful Herodian masonry found in the land of Israel underneath the Antonia fortress. One person got it. Okay, so you could just go on and on and on and on. And another thing that we encounter are mikvaot, ritual baths, all around the Temple Mount, getting closer and closer. And these are, by the way, public ritual baths, exactly what we'd expect to find right alongside the Temple Mount. and we have one identified as a mikveh underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was documented by Hamilton in the 1930s of the 20th century. Other artifacts found, again, right underneath the walls of the Temple Mount, we have the famous golden bell, the Pure for God seal, and the smoking gun, which is the trumpeting sign, Lebetat Kiyav el-Akhriz, which is something that we know historically and we know from the rabbinical sources that they would blow the trumpet before the Sabbath and in other times. You can see the quote from Josephus. The point where it was custom for one of the priests to stand and give a notice by sound of a trumpet in the afternoon of the approach and on the following evening of the close of every Sabbath day. And we find it exactly where we expect to find it. Another interesting artifact that was found is a Greek inscription of a donation. This donation was by a Jew from the island of Rhodes, and the inscription reads that it is a donation for the pavement. What pavement? If it came right underneath the Temple Mount, it's probably talking about the pavement that was donated to the Temple Mount, and we know from historical and rabbinical sources that there were stones of various colors which paved the courts of the temple, and the illegal excavation that was done in 1999, many such color stones, beautiful pavement stones, were found, and these date to, again, the Herodian period, and the dating is solid, and it is by parallels. The dating is by parallels, and we were actually able to, this again I covered on one of my last talks, but we were able to reconstruct some of these floors that were in the temple or in its courts. And again, this is done by matching these stones to other Herodian building sites which can still be seen today. Another very important artifact that was found in this rubble, again removed from within inside the Temple Mount, is a seal impression from the first temple period, the time of King Solomon's temple, bearing a name of a priest which served in the temple. The name Imer is mentioned on the seal impression, and Imer is the 16th family of the 24 families that took part in the work done on the temple. And if you read Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 1, Pashur, son of Imer, the priest, he was the chief officer in the house of the Lord. So we have a direct indication to Solomon's temple coming out of the area which we would expect to find it. Again, a very good indication that the temple was there. The seal probably was part of the treasury of the temple. You can see here a depiction of how it maybe was placed upon a sack. And we're coming up on time here, so I guess there's only one thing to say, and that's checkmate. Sorry about that. Those who trust in the Lord are as Mount Zion, which cannot be moved but abides forever. Thank you very much.